Well, hello, Bioneers. We're here for the panel on plutocracy and democracy, which is a subject really dear to my heart, something I know a little bit about, but not nearly as much as the luminaries that we're here with today. Tom Hartman, whose keynote we heard this morning. Tom is the #1 progressive talk show host in the country and globally, I believe, and has written and spoken extensively about monopoly as well as the solutions we can think about. Maurice is the co-executive director of the Action Center for Race and Economy, aka ACRE. He works with community organizations and labor unions on campaigns to create equitable communities by dismantling systems of wealth extraction that target Black and Brown communities. And he's working to dismantle a monopolistic system that he calls racial capitalism, which is something I'm really eager to hear more about. Maurice has many years of community organizing experience on issues such as housing, revenue and budgets, policing and incarceration, corporate accountability, and education justice. And Stacy Mitchell, who's the co-director of the esteemed Institute for Local Self-Reliance. She has acted as one of the most effective and energetic voices on the national stage for challenging Amazon, which today is the epitome of monopoly gone feral. Stacy is co-director of the Institute and directs the initiative to decentralize economic power and level the playing field for independent businesses. She's produced many influential reports and articles and testified before Congress and was quite seminal in some of the antitrust actions that are arising around Amazon right now. She's also helped to design local and federal policies and collaborated to build effective coalitions and campaigns. So what I'd like to do is to cover some of the basic ground that we're all on, and also the work that each of you is doing, and look obviously at solutions, not just the meta problems that we're facing. And I would encourage all of you to talk amongst yourselves whenever you want to. If somebody says something you want to respond to, please feel free. If we have time, we will take questions. You can send your questions in the chat box, and we'll try to leave some time at the end to do that. So I wrote a screenplay years ago that's about the period of the robber barons that actually almost got produced. It came super close, but no cigar. And I did a lot of research about that period, which was until now the sort of plutocratic apex. And I'd like to share a quote that I learned about at that time that I think will help to set the stage for what we're really talking about here. This was written and spoken by Frederick Townsend Martin in 1889. He was known as the millionaire with a mission. And he became a class traitor and betrayed his lineage of a millionaire family. And it was later published in a book that he wrote called The Passing of the Idle Rich, which is a very rich book. So here's what he said, and then I'd love we can take it from there. Among my own people, I seldom hear purely political discussions. When we're discussing pro and con, the relative merits of candidates, or the relative importance of political policies, the discussion almost invariably comes down to a question of business efficiency. We care absolutely nothing about any other political question, save inasmuch as it threatens or fortifies existing conditions. Touch the question of the tariff, touch the question of the income tax, touch the problem of railroad regulation, or touch the most vital of all business matters, the question of general federal regulation of industrial corporations, and the people amongst whom I live my life become immediately rabid partisans. It matters not one iota what political party is in power or what president holds the reins of office. We are not politicians or public thinkers. We are the rich. We own America. We got it, God knows how, but we intend to keep it if we can, by throwing all the tremendous weight of our support, our influence, our money, our political connection, our purchased senators, our hungry congressmen, our public-speaking demagogues into the scale against any legislation, any political platform, any presidential campaign that threatens the integrity of our state. So I thought that has always made a big impression on me. Tom, I'd love to start with you as a historian. Most people don't really understand that this struggle in this country goes in what became the United States, actually goes back to the pre-revolutionary times. The Boston Tea Party was in fact not about taxation with representation, but was an anti-monopoly action. I wondered if you'd care to talk a little bit about that.
Sure. That's one of our founding stories that we learn about in elementary school that we typically learn wrong. In the Queen Elizabeth I signed the charter for the British East India Company on December 1st, 1601, and brought into birth the modern corporation. It was the first of what we would today call modern corporations. And it was modeled on the Dutch trading companies, which had existed for about a century before that. And at that time, England was just starting to come up, and Holland or the Netherlands were really much more powerful. And they basically, by the 1770s, had monopolized the trade of most of the world that interacted with Europe. And had very radical laws that had been passed by the British Parliament that regulating commerce in the United States. It was, for example, illegal to manufacture fine clothing in the United States. It had to be bought from the British East India Company, and it had to be manufactured in the United Kingdom. When George Washington was told that he had been elected president, Henry Knox rode up to his house and said, you've got it, or you're the president now. And Washington had two requests. One, that Knox would go tell his mother, who was about to die. And the other was that Knox would ride 2 days up to Danbury, Connecticut, to the home of Daniel Hinsdale, who was known to Washington as an underground tailor, a man who could make fine clothing in defiance of British law, or who had been making it. And Hinsdale made Washington's clothing that he was inaugurated in, a good brown American suit, although the British black from the painting was for the painting, that was British. And so one of the other things that they had monopolized, in addition to literally hundreds of items that could have been manufactured here in the United States, and these are echoes, by the way, of Gandhi's protests against the East India Company making it illegal to manufacture clothing in India, thus the spinning wheel as his logo. And the salt protests. But one of the other things that they had monopolized was tea. And tea was the drug of choice, along with alcohol, in those colonies at that time, all up and down the eastern seaboard. You couldn't pass a city block without a tea house. They were the centers of social life and of commerce. And about half the tea sold in the United States was coming from smugglers. And the British East India Company was very flipped out about that, and they were hiring people to in fact, some of the pirates were actually employed by the Brits to stop that trade. But in any case, in 1773, in the fall of 1773, well, actually, just a little backstory very quickly. There was a Great Depression in 1770. It was a massive economic crash that happened in the UK and echoed into the United States, or into the colonies. And in response to this, the East India Company, whose virtually all of their stock was owned by the British royal family and members of the House of Lords and the House of and Parliament, and some of the very wealthy people in the UK, they asked Parliament to give them basically a break. They were squeezed very, very badly at that point. It was the worst time that they'd had in 70 years. And so Parliament passed the Tea Act. And the Tea Act said that the way it worked was when the East India Company imported tea from India into the UK for shipment to us, they would pay tax on it when they brought it into the UK. So they had millions of pounds of tea in their warehouses that they had already paid taxes on. And what the Tea Act did was gave the East India Company this massive rebate on the taxes that they had already paid. So they got this huge cash advance. and dropped radically the tax on the tea that they would ship to North America. And this allowed them to compete with the smugglers and try to run them out of business in all these tea shops up and down the East Coast, and which really pissed off the colonists. So this came to a head in the fall of 1773 when 3 ships came into Boston Harbor, and there were also ships coming into New York and Philadelphia Harbor, and into Pennsylvania. I don't recall the harbor. I think it was Phil. In any case, and so a group of people gathered and marched out. There was a lot of debate about it and everything. And I tell the story in my book on Monopoly. And marched down to Griffin's Wharf that evening. It was actually done in total silence. And they threw the tea, 360 some odd, 64 as I recall, crates of tea, valued in today's dollars in over $1 million, over $1 million worth of tea into Boston Harbor. And then, of course, the Brits, in response to that, passed the Boston Ports Act that said that no commerce could take place through the Boston port until the city of Boston paid back the East India Company $1 million for that tea, which of course Boston didn't do. And that led right to the Boston Massacre, which led right to the shot heard around the world, which led right to the American Revolution, or actually that was the point at which Thomas Jefferson and his friends decided, because just a year earlier, he'd written this pamphlet called, I'm forgetting the name, it was a very long name, but something about British Americans, basically calling people to be good, loyal subjects of Britain. And he changed his mind, and that led right to the Declaration of Independence, which led to the American Revolution. So the American Revolution was fought, was triggered by the Boston Tea Party, which was done in response to a tax cut for the largest monopolistic corporation on earth.
Yeah, and actually in the early days of the Republic, there was great concern about corporations and corporate power, partly coming out of all this, and corporations were kept on a very tight rein. And Tom, I just want to touch on one other thing and then we'll move on. But you also have written extensively about the 14th Amendment, which ostensibly was in support of freed slaves, but in fact ended up being a corporate play. I wonder if you could just say a little bit about that.
Yeah, the 14th Amendment, which gave formerly enslaved people equal protection under the law. In 1886, there were a series of the railroad barons basically were trying to grab more and more and more political power along with the economic power that they already had. They were among the top 4 oligarchic enterprises in the United States, and monopolistic as well. And they had bribed Stephen J. Field, who was a member of the U.S. Supreme Court. And back in those days, the members of the Supreme Court also did what was called riding the circuit. They were also the chief judge in the circuit court. And Field was the judge in the Ninth Circuit, which was California. And he had been bribed by Jay Gould and some buddies. They told him they were going to help make him president if he would help this accomplish. And so there was a series of cases that this is, just a decade after the 14th Amendment was passed. There were a series of cases that are referred to as the California tax cases. There were 7 of them altogether that came out of California and were sent to the U.S. Supreme Court by Field. He sent them from his own court in the Ninth Circuit to himself on the Supreme Court. And Field argued, and the railroads argued. J.B. Sanderson was the lawyer for the railroads at that time, argued that because the Southern Pacific Railroad had to pay a penny a mile property tax on their railroad throughways in Santa Clara County and 2 cents a mile, in Santa Ana County, and 2 cents a mile in Santa Clara County, that was a violation of their protection, their equal protection under the law rights under the 14th Amendment. And of course, that would require them to be covered by the 14th Amendment, which says persons repeatedly. So in these 7 cases, this was one of them. This was the most notable of them that went to the Supreme Court. The railroads lost all 7 cases. But this one particular case, Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad, where the county sued the railroad and said, you got to pay your damn taxes. And the railroad said, no way, it's, we're being denied equal protection under the law. What what lawyers will tell you, and it's fascinating. I gave a talk. I've given all kinds of talks on this all around the country at various law schools, and I'll start out by saying, with a room full of law students and law professors, how many of you know that in 1886 in Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad, corporations were given personhood rights under the Constitution so that they could claim things like free speech rights under the First Amendment, privacy rights under the Fourth Amendment, et cetera. And everybody's hand will go up. And that it was in that decision. Well, it turns out that decision, actually, the railroads lost. Morrison Remick Wade, who was the Chief Justice of the court, just dismissed the argument altogether. And Delphin Delmas was the lawyer who was arguing on behalf of the county. He was the guy who saved the redwoods in California. Both of these cases, by the way, he did pro bono. And Delphin Delmas famously said, what, you would give corporations the right to marry? And he went through all the absurdities of this. And Wade agreed with him. But weirdly, there was the guy who was the clerk of the court, who stayed in Washington, D.C. all year long, even though the court was only in session 3 months and the other justices were all out riding the circuit. The clerk of the court, in the head note to that decision, a head note has no legal standing. It's basically there for lawyers and law students. It's a short summary of the case. In the head note to that case, he said that the Chief Justice had asserted that corporations are persons under the law and therefore entitled to equal protection under the law. And the Supreme Court never actually ruled that corporations are persons. There have been rulings that danced close to that. They certainly have artificial person status. That was established in 1815 in a case that involved Dartmouth College. But they've never explicitly ruled until the 1890s and then into the 20th century, when they started simply asserting that it had been done in 1886. And in fact, the Citizens United decision in 2010 cites Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad, and falsely, again, wrongly. So, this is another one of those BS stories that get shoveled to us and even to our lawyers and law students, that I think could be subject to challenge.
Yes, exactly. Thank you so much. Well, Stacy, by way of getting us to today and to Amazon, you mentioned, Tom, the Southern Pacific Railroad, also known as the Octopus in its time, very famous novel by Frank Norris. That was what my screenplay was about, and I just wanted to give you a setup because that was kind of the time when they literally wrote the playbook. It was the genesis of modern corporate monopoly as we know it today, driven by the vast new wealth created by the Industrial Revolution, and in particular by the railroads, which were basically the internet of their day. So the Big Four, as they were known, one of whom was Collis Huntington, who was one of the most notorious robber barons, had a background that led them, they recognized that commerce, whoever controlled commerce was going to, or whoever controlled the railroads was going to control commerce. So Huntington had already made a small fortune during the California gold rush by cornering the market on nails, shovels, and blasting powder, and then selling them to miners for all that the traffic would bear, basically. In other words, get a monopoly, buy low, sell high, and eliminate the competition. Huntington went to Washington with $200,000 in cash and came back without any receipts. And he was later busted for bribery on a huge scale. But he came back with the following. He got a package deal that included 12 million acres of free land grants, cheap federal loans for his own company to build the railroad, which today would be considered self-dealing and highly illegal, and the right to set his own freight rates. So farmers that were shipping their goods to market were quoted one price at spring planting and then the higher one at the harvest. When they protested, the railroad demanded to see their bookkeeping and literally adjusted their pricing to within pennies of bankrupting the farmers. And it had the highest freight rates in the country, except, of course, for the rebates that it gave secretly to customers such as John D. Rockefeller, one of whose mottos was "competition is a sin." So this makes me think of Amazon. I don't know if this playbook resonates with you.
Yeah, I think that the railroads are a very apt analogy to what we face with Amazon today. Just to sort of pick up, I think, where Tom started us off. I mean, I think concentrated economic power is a threat to democracy. And to a large extent, the history of trying to realize our ideals of building a true democracy has always been about how do we have rights politically, but also how do we have rights economically? And that concentrated economic power is a serious threat to our well-being and to our democracy. And that has played out in all kinds of different ways and sort of ebbed and flowed throughout our history. Originally, questions of corporate power were really handled at the state level because corporations generally they were chartered at the state level, and they generally didn't extend beyond state lines. And that changed in the 19th century with the rise, particularly of the railroads. And suddenly you had these corporations that became an infrastructure for the entire national economy. And you had industrialists at the time who gained control of those railroad lines. People like John D. Rockefeller, part of how he built his monopoly in oil was that he sort of commandeered relationships he had with railroad companies and got these setups where he was able to move his oil to market, but his competitors were not. And these industrialists favored that owned the railroads, favored their own commodities. They charged exorbitant prices to farmers and small businesses and so on. And that's what really led to our first national anti-monopoly laws. Even before the Sherman Act, we had laws designed to address railroad power and interstate commerce. And then in 1890, the Sherman Act, which for various reasons never really was fully used. We have some additional laws that come along in the 1910s. And then really it isn't until like the Great Depression that we get sort of the full, sort of a fuller realization of our anti-monopoly laws. Today we are at a point. So in essence, our history sort of gone up and down with the degree to which we've confronted monopoly power through law. And for the last 40 years, we've been at a real downward kind of low point where we've really largely ignored corporate power and treated it as though it weren't an issue and it were somehow separate from our politics, separate from our democracy. And in that space, along have come a new set of companies that have an even more dangerous form of monopoly power than the concentration that we see across farming or retail, Walmart, Monsanto, all of these other big companies, which are hugely destructive. But the rise of Amazon, Google, Facebook is sort of another degree of monopoly power. And that's because they function very much like the railroads. They control the infrastructure of commerce and communications. And so they're able to set the rules. They control who can be on those platforms and how they operate. And they can favor their own products. They can essentially govern us. We should recognize them as a form of private government. And so the analogy of the railroad is very, very apt. And also, I think the solutions that ultimately came about around the railroad is part of the solution that we need with Amazon.
And could you describe a little bit, both from the point of view of Amazon, but also more broadly, why monopoly is so destructive?
Yeah, I mean, it is essentially, I think, it is this issue of democracy when you have a small number of people who are able to control huge markets, huge industries. It is a way of taking away, making other people subject to you in various ways. How we make economic decisions. I very much believe that what we need to do is we need to just disperse economic power, that we need stronger unions, we need more independent local businesses, we need more cooperatively and publicly owned infrastructure and institutions to deliver what we need. We need more democratic oversight. The concentration of power in the hands of someone like Jeff Bezos, who's now worth $200 billion, which is extraordinary, is just antithetical to all of those values. And to understand a little bit more about Amazon in particular, Amazon captures about half of all online spending, but the even more think relevant statistic is that about 2/3 of Americans, when they want to buy something online, they start at Amazon. It used to be that they went to a search engine and they put in what they were looking for, and they would get access to, run across all sorts of different results, including local businesses, also including Amazon. Now, most people start at Amazon. And what that means is that if you make or sell anything and you want to reach people online, you have to sell on Amazon's platform. And they essentially control your business. They can levy a toll on you. They can stop you from selling. They set the terms. They decide what we see as consumers, what we don't see. And Google and Facebook, similarly, are these kind of powerful gatekeepers. And that concentration of power means that we have an incredible concentration of wealth, with lots of people who are struggling to get by and who have no control over their own livelihoods. We have lots of communities that have lost their sense of agency and direction. And then we increasingly have these giant companies that use the incredible power that they have over how our economic systems are run to gain a great deal of power politically and power over Congress and to really set the rules. So in all of these ways, I think we need to understand Amazon and some of these other companies as a form of autocratic private government. And the solution, in effect, is to throw their tea in the harbor.
Right, exactly. And Amazon, of course, Shoshana Zuboff calls this time surveillance capitalism. Amazon is also collecting the data on all of these companies. And if they see something that really takes off, they can just imitate it and eliminate that company from existence. So it's even more diabolical at that level now with big data. Maurice, as we know, this country, it was actually founded on several original sins, beginning with the theft of lands of native peoples and enslavement and genocide, and certainly with enslavement of Africans. Immigrants have been relentlessly exploited in all kinds of ways. I'm very interested to hear this is intrinsic, apparently, to capitalism. Today, these monopolies are having probably the very worst effects in communities of color and low-income communities. And I know that's part of what your work is about, but I'd love to hear what your overview is, your perspective about racial capitalism and the kinds of campaigns that you're involved with and your networks are involved in to begin to really challenge this.
Yeah, it's another one of the stories about the founding of the country that we learn in school that, usually doesn't bring up the fact that, we had free coerced labor from enslaved Africans for many, many years, which was able to create lots of profit for the country. So, the way I look at it is, there's a key factor. The really key factor of capitalism is a drive to produce the maximum profit by paying as little as possible for labor and materials. There are a couple of things that can stand in the way of that. One, as Stacey talked about, is a form of economic democracy. So forcing there to be some competitors in your space. So even if you try to pay your workers $5 an hour to maximize your profit, someone else is willing to pay $6 an hour and your workers leave. So there's some competition to get you to reduce your profit, or government regulations that stop you from doing things that increase your profit. So we all know about collusion and why it's illegal to sort of go get a group of firms together and all agree that you're going to charge the same exact price so that you can stay in the market and take as much from a set group of people as possible. There's a government regulation against doing that. There were government regulations on the books against forming monopolies, and that's sort of the other factor that's sort of pushing things down. Racial capitalism really, is a term that speaks to the real founding, both the evolution and the founding of capitalism, and just to lift up the fact that the fundamental form that the exploitation takes place is on top of racist ideals and racist profit practices. So in that terms, think, of course, slavery and the production of crops in the South by by Africans, and really global slavery, sharecropping, low-wage immigrant work, all of these things that really at different points in our economy have really powered our entire economy are built on top of these racist systems of social division. And in addition to that, really, breed these racialized scapegoats that can find their way into all parts of society and really just infiltrate the entire society. So that's where it shifts from, there were certainly explicitly, intentionally racist people who were slave owners. And, even Jeff Bezos would say, of course, slave owning is bad. Slave owners were bad. But the practices have seeped out so far that you can trace some of the same practices that monopoly owners and operators like Bezos do to those same racialized practices that people did in the era of slavery. And that's what allows us really to correctly charge that their very business model is racist and is takes advantage of race in the same way that other economic forms have in the past. A colleague and friend of mine, Derek Hamilton, likes to say that the U.S. economy is structured on rules that either privilege or exploit based on race. If we agree that concentration of corporate power is something that is happening in our economy, which I think is, of course, inarguable, and monopolies are sort of the pinnacle of that corporate concentration, then we must look to them as the ones who are sort of the high watermark for racially motivated, racist undertones, privileging and profiteering. So that's how we sort of weave together this notion of racial capitalism, some of the drawbacks of capitalism itself, and racial inequality and monopoly.
Right. Well, it was very interesting. I forget if it was last year or the year before, but when Amazon did the national contest, for a city to bid, for them to build there, and they ended up wanting to work in Queens, and the community came together and actually stopped that, which was quite astonishing. But what were they trying to stop?
Yeah, for folks who missed it, Amazon hosted this kind of game show-like search for the best city to build their second headquarters in, and lots of cities were on the list, including my city of Detroit. And the way that the contest worked is basically whoever could give them the most tax giveaways or benefits was going to be the city that they chose. So, from leaked documents and some public documents, we know that cities were offering all sorts of things, no income tax by Amazon employees for 35 years, no property taxes paid at all. We'll build a rail line for you. We'll give you this set of buildings in our downtown, all sorts of things that cities were offering. And when Queens was chosen, I think the residents there realized a couple of things. One, this isn't really a good business partner to have in your neighborhood. So there's lots of diverse businesses in Queens that have been there for lots of years. And one thing that we know that happens when Amazon comes into a particular place is they suck away both the labor market and just drive down the quality of the actual area, while not paying any taxes into that area in order to upkeep other things. That, along with the company having no response to things like them having contracts with ICE or other policing entities. The areas that they were looking at going into were filled with immigrants, either first or second generation immigrants. To have a neighbor coming in, this huge corporation that is so aggressive towards immigrants with their contracts with ICE just wasn't something that was possible. And frankly, New York City is, along with lots of other states in this moment, there are lots of financial needs there in schools and roads and parks, and there's a lot of financial need. I think communities correctly, agreed that it just doesn't make sense to give giveaways to one of the wealthiest corporations on earth, run by the richest man on earth, when we could instead fund our schools more, fund our train system more, et cetera. So yeah, I mean, that's a little of why the Queen's pushback happened. That was a higher profile, and I will say that both Amazon and Google and other companies really do this all of the time, and they go from city to city, lots of times not even making the news at all, looking for as big of a handout as possible of taxpayer money to continue to increase their profit, operating essentially without having to pay any taxes or fees in a particular community.
This is really, if I just jump in, I think this is what we're really, I think, increasingly realizing in the pushback in Queens and increasingly around the country around monopoly power. There is this growing focus on structure, economic structure, and on policy. And this we've been living for a number of decades here, imagining that big companies have been taking over and growing in size and power simply because they were better at what they did, right? They were more efficient. Like every time you walked past a corner drugstore that had closed its doors, or another workplace that had gone out of business, another small town somewhere that was struggling, you just sort of assumed that this was like the price of progress, the natural evolution of companies taking over that were just better at what they did. And what's really true, and what a lot of our research and other research shows, is that in fact, what has happened is that we've written a set of policies that have favored these companies extraordinarily. And as they've grown, they've been able to manipulate government further and further and further to their own advantage. I mean, Amazon has picked up over $4 billion in local and state subsidies. Governments across the country writing Amazon checks. If you're a local hardware store, and you want to open a second location, like good luck getting a dime from your city council. You'll be laughed out and told that this is a free market and you have to compete, right? Meanwhile, your biggest competitor is getting these huge subsidies. And that's not all. Amazon didn't collect sales tax in most places for over 20 years, an incredible advantage. And we see them even today in the midst of the COVID crisis, not actually stepping up and providing protection for the employees that are in their warehouses, the way that they're really legally obligated to do, and certainly ethically obligated to do. Again, if you're a small local businesses that has shut down or is operating responsibly, you're in this competitive environment where the government has essentially given Amazon free rein to do what it wants. And our anti-monopoly laws, the fact that we really shelved our antitrust laws 40 years ago, has been a whole set of tools that again has fueled the exercise of power. So the pushback in Queens that Maurice talked about, and that we're really seeing at the grassroots level across the country, is this growing focus on, it's not just about calling these companies out for their bad behavior and trying to get them to do better. It's about recognizing that this is our government and we own these rules and we need to change these laws, and we need to think about, well, what does an economic structure look like that actually serves a democracy and that actually serves the needs of people?
Yeah, and you mentioned policy because a lot of the turning point, as you all know, was 1971, the Powell memo at the Supreme Court level, that basically, to quote Oscar Wilde, a fool knows the price of everything and the value of nothing. And monopoly was basically redefined as purely an issue of price points. If you could get the best price for the quote consumer, which is, we're not citizens anymore, we're consumers now, that was legitimate, and that was entirely bipartisan. I mean, there was no political, daylight there between the two parties in that way, and that's certainly part of what's brought us to this point. One of the first thoughts I had when COVID hit and it was clear what was happening was, oh boy, here comes disaster capitalism on steroids. Yeah. And my concern here is basically when the smoke clears, whenever this is, we're going to be left in a world of giants and dwarves. There will be almost nothing in between. Countless small businesses, medium-sized businesses will be wiped out or acquired. Is this really where we're heading? So, what's good is that there is finally an antitrust movement building again today, and a higher public awareness, although it still has a good ways to go. But I would love to hear from each of you on the solution side. what is being done, what you're doing, and where you think the trajectory could go if things go well. Tom, I know you've written so much about this, of broad solutions, but I'd love, perhaps we could go around the circle and you could respond to this.
Sure. When Reagan stopped enforcing the anti-monopoly laws in the early 1980s, pretty much everything changed in America. What both Maurice and Stacy were describing with Amazon and with other companies, Walmart really pioneered after that. Although it goes back before that, the big anchor stores and malls and things. But obviously we need to restart our antitrust laws and bring them up to date, and we need to deal with tech in a very unique way. And I'll leave that to Stacy. I think the most important thing, though, is educating people. I don't think most Americans realize that the average American family pays a $5,000 a year monopoly tax. Americans pay twice as much for cable television as any other developed country in the world. We pay 2 to 3 times as much for cell phone service. We pay more than twice as much for Wi-Fi. We pay more for airfare. We pay 2 to 10 times more for pharmaceuticals. The list just goes on. And when Robert Bork started selling his snake oil back in the 60s and early 70s of, abandoning the idea that a corporation had multiple constituencies that they had to be concerned with, including communities, employees, customers, the institution of the corporation itself, and then, of course, the shareholders, and that everything really should be just driven by price. And then the parallel, Milton Friedman theory, Bork was a student of Milton Friedman's at the Chicago School, that shareholder value is the number one thing. But when that sales pitch happened, this is what we ended up with, and everybody kind of assumed that, gee, we get lower prices out of all this. We got all this cheap stuff, and no, we're spending a lot more for a lot of things than anybody else, any other developed country in the world, anyway, does, because they enforce their anti-monopoly laws and we don't. So I think this step one is waking people up, educating people.
Yeah, I think one thing that I've been thinking about a lot since the pandemic started, there are, I live in a neighborhood where most of my neighbors are elderly and at high risk for contracting the coronavirus in a way that would be a real health complication for them. And they've been ordering a lot on Amazon, a lot of stuff, everything from kind of regular groceries to paper towels to things to keep them busy in the house, et cetera. It really makes us sort of, and they love it too. That's the other thing. Everyone gets excited when they're getting an Amazon package. They love the company. And I actually don't think that that's a huge problem. I think if we're trying to take down the corporation, of course, it's a huge problem if the country loves it. But the fact that there's an infrastructure that exists so that we could get things that people need to them quickly at a time where they can't get them themselves, that's actually great. And I don't want to have sort of a Luddite approach to how we deal with it, where, the way to deal with Amazon is to wipe Amazon off of the face of the earth, or wipe this model off of the face of the earth. Because that's not what we did with railroads either, right? We didn't say the railroads were a problem, let's blow up all of the railroad lines, so then it's no longer a problem. I think that there is a piece of infrastructure, whether it can be operated in the way that it currently is, at the size that it is a real question, to which personally I think the answer is no. We have to break it up, and we have to have some sort of more democratic control over it. But yeah, I think that there is what's been proven is there is actually a piece of infrastructure there that they were able to build. And they built it using really, really shady and not so great strategies, but now it is there. And we can actually, we can take it, we can use it, we can do a lot of the things that they're doing. Of course, controlling for, we don't want to pay the workers crappy wages, we want it to be safe, we don't want it to be harming the environment, et cetera. But I think that there are things there that prove that this is a piece of infrastructure that we can use. Yeah,
I think the coming months are going to really be a big test for the Biden administration and for Democratic leadership in the House in particular, about whether they are going to stand up and repudiate this history, starting with Clinton in particular, of of allowing the economy to consolidate and indeed pushing for policies that consolidate it. We're in danger really of repeating the mistakes, I think, that were made in the aftermath of the financial crisis. We, at that time, the response from the US government was to keep the big banks whole and, in fact, to enlarge their power and allow untold numbers of Americans to lose their livelihoods and their homes and their wealth. Particularly Black Americans suffered just incredible loss of economic wealth at that time. And the ramifications of that we are still living with, both in the incredibly unequal economy and also in the way it destabilized our politics. So we're now facing a similar kind of set of questions, and this time it's not so much about houses and banks as it is about consolidation in the hands of Amazon versus independent businesses and the people who work for a living. And so the response to this crisis has to be not only to kind of get us through it, and to respond to people's needs, but it's to use the moment to restructure the economy in a more equitable and just way. One of the things that I'm really looking for, and again, just to, I'll echo Maurice is saying, like, the issue isn't technology. It's not online commerce or, the cloud or any of the other industries that Amazon controls. It's the fact that those things are controlled by this single unaccountable player that operates essentially above any kind of law. That's the problem that we have to address, not the technology, not how much we enjoy online commerce and its convenience. That's all great. One of the most important things that's been happening in the past year, in my view, is the investigation that's been going on in the House and the antitrust subcommittee. They've done over a year-long investigation of big tech, and released a huge report at the beginning of October on their findings. And they found that these companies, Amazon, Google, Facebook, and Apple, are in fact monopolies, that they have monopoly power, that they exercise that power in ways that harms people and harms independent businesses and communities. And then they lay out a set of recommendations. And one of there are lots of great recommendations in there about how to get our anti-monopoly laws back where they need to be. But their first recommendation is about breakups. And essentially, with regard to Amazon, what they've called for is exactly how we handled the railroad. So in 1906, we passed a law that said, look, if you're a railroad, that's fine. You can't also own other companies. Like, you have to be a neutral carrier, a common carrier. You can't have a financial interest in commodities, because then you're going to favor your own commodities over those of those who need the railroad. And that's what we should do with Amazon. We should say, look, you're an online, you as an online platform needs to be separate from Amazon as a retailer. AWS needs to be spun off. And their logistics infrastructure, they've now built a logistics operation, a shipping operation that rivals UPS and even the Postal Service in scale, that also needs to be spun off as an independent company. And that Amazon, when it's functioning as critical infrastructure, needs to be subject to a set of public oversight laws. So those are some of the key reforms, I think, and they are laid out incredibly well in this House report. And so what I'm really curious and looking for as we come into the new Congress is whether we get legislation and whether particularly the leadership really stands up for those reforms.
Well, it's interesting too, because there is movement for different reasons, presumably, between the Democrats and the Republicans. There appear to be very different motives there on their part. But Stacey, I know a lot of in a lot of ways, we're facing state capture essentially by these companies, whichever party it is. That's why I read that quote at the beginning of the passing of the Otto Rich. It's one estate that they're all part of in that way. But I know you're also working at the state level and the more local levels, as you are, Maurice, as well. And short of federal action, what else can we do?
Yeah, I can jump in with a few things, and then I'm sure Maurice can add to them. I mean, I think one of the things that's really encouraging, if you look with this lens, so I work at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, and we're a national organization that works around the country, and we fight corporate control and help to build vibrant, local, equitable economic systems. We work across a lot of different sectors of the economy and at all three levels of government, focused particularly on policy change. And what we found in our work, and what's really striking to me, is that as much as questions of monopoly power have been sort of dormant at the national level for many decades until recently, and that has not been true at the local level, that there is a vibrant anti-monopoly movement at the local level. It doesn't describe itself that way in those terms, but it has existed for quite a while. And we see that in the hundreds and hundreds of municipalities that have built their own publicly owned broadband networks and told Time Warner and the other Charter and the other giants to go away. we're gonna have better internet at lower cost. We've seen it in places like Oklahoma and other states that have passed referendum blocking corporate ownership of farmland and taking action against some of the big ag monopolies. We see it in places like North Dakota, where they've said that you can't operate a pharmacy in the state unless you're a pharmacist. So every pharmacy in North Dakota is a locally owned independent business. And we see this in all kinds of ways across the country, that people have used local government to try to push back against corporate power and to actually build systems locally that they control. We decided this summer to put out a guide. It's called Fighting Monopoly Power, and it's a guide to state and local action. So it goes through a whole range of tools that people have at the state and local level, some of those that I just named, but also things like starting a public bank, which your city can do and can be a great way to begin to untangle our financial system from Wall Street and begin to build locally controlled banking systems that work with community banks and with local credit unions to actually channel our capital where it needs to go, to create the kinds of businesses and jobs and economic development that we need. We can enact rules that eliminate subsidies. We see it even, Vermont, for example, has been really very strict about not allowing the large retailers to be selling non-essential things. When other businesses have been closed during COVID, they've said to Walmart, yeah, you're not going to be selling TVs. Sorry, you can sell food because that's essential. You can't do this other stuff. And so there are just tons of powers at the state and local level. And I think when we start to look at the economy through that lens, we can see all the ways that we can begin to shift things.
Yeah, ditto all of those things, and looking to the things that folks who are in communities where Amazon is, or workers that work for Amazon, are asking for. So safer conditions, better wages, et cetera. A lot of those things are actually, there are local tools that we're used to using that we can use on Amazon that, we just have to sort of build a little bit of spine to do. So ensuring workplace safety in a particular municipality, you can pass a law that just does that in the way that you want. I think part of what scares people away from it is this is a big and powerful company. This company does actually do a lot of political spending. They do a lot of lobbying. We saw what happened with Uber and Lyft in California. Imagine if that was targeting Amazon and the endless bank that they would have to sort of fight back against it. And that's why I really think, I'm obviously biased because I'm an organizer at heart, but I think sort of getting together with folks who you can still continue to do your local organizing, but connecting with folks who are doing that same type of organizing all around the country is really, really key, so that we're sort of connected in a way that starts to make us a more formidable force against this huge company. So Stacy and I are both part of a coalition to take on Amazon called Athena, which is just exactly that. It's folks who are, from anything from small community organizations to national policy groups who are all together thinking about, how do we actually hold this company accountable, break up this company, and institute the type of democratic economy that we want to.
Two quick points. One, we may want to point out that when the Nixon administration decided to break up AT&T under the antitrust laws. It finished, as I recall, under Carter. That people who own shares, stock, because the inevitable response is, "Oh my God, you're going to kill the corporation. My 401k is going to go to hell." That's going to be the sales pitch. The people who owned one share of AT&T stock, when it was split into 7 baby Bells and the Bell Labs became Lucian Technologies, that one share of stock became 7 or 8 shares of stock that actually was worth more than that one share of stock. So it actually increased shareholder value. The other point that I'd love to hear Stacy and Maurice speak to is Amazon is in the perfect position to know what people are buying. And now they have started selling their own line of batteries. They've started selling their own line of music stands. They've started selling their, fill in the blanks, right? They're selling stuff from small businesses, which is their sales pitch, right? We've got, half of our business is small businesses flowing through us. But what they're doing is they're very carefully looking at which one of these small businesses are actually doing pretty good, so we can just screw them, wipe them out, and start, find some manufacturer to make the generic version of what they're selling, and put them in the ground. And that again seems like the kind of thing that needs to be publicized very heavily. People need to realize, the real world consequences of this. We sort of saw it with Walmart. And it became kind of conventional wisdom that every time a Walmart opens in a community, 110 to 140 companies go out of business in the next 5 years. I don't think anybody thinks that way about Amazon. Tragically, or obviously a lot of people do, but it's not the conventional wisdom that it was around by 2000 or the middle part of the first decade of the 2000s around Walmart. I'm curious, Stacy and Maurice, what you guys think about it.
Yeah, I think it goes back to this idea that this real myth that any success by a corporation is because they innovated, like Stacy was talking about. So, we do a popular education on Amazon and monopoly, and one example we give is, imagine that you have a company that sells diapers online, and you're doing pretty well, and you're paying your workers well, and you're using good materials. And then someone comes along and uses your same materials, pays the workers less, and charges a quarter of the price. Well, that they're losing money. There's no way that they could be making money on that item. They're definitely losing money. Their strategy is to just push people like you out of the market. What can you do? And that's not a fictional example. Like, that has happened several times. You've listed some of the more normal things, in my opinion. Like a music stand. I've seen animal entrapment cages, like all sorts of things you would never think. Why would Amazon want to manufacture its own blank? And they do. And the reason is they can push folks out of the market by cutting down their price. And then they control the entire thing. So it becomes not just a monopoly, but a whole set of monopolies, really, an interwound set of monopolies.
I think that's right. This is really gets to sort of the integrated nature of what Amazon is, and again, begins to sort of illuminate why breaking them up and restructuring the company is really critical to how we have them operate in a way that works, that creates a fair and just and open and competitive economy. For people who don't think about this much, it's Amazon sells its own goods. As like a retailer, where it's buying goods from suppliers, selling them on its website. It also manufactures its own private label goods. So there are thousands of items that are Amazon branded goods. And it hosts on its platform all of these third-party sellers. And those third-party sellers are independent retailers, they're major brands, big companies that you would know, small companies. There are a bunch of them overseas, all kinds of different sorts of businesses. And what that enables, essentially, if you want to sell online right now, because Amazon is getting so many people right out of the gate, so many eyeballs right out of the gate, your choice is either you can hang your shingle out on the World Wide Web on your own, have your own site, but it's like you're like on a dirt road that few people are actually traveling by and ever finding you. Or you can become a seller on Amazon. And if you become a seller on Amazon, you are giving to your most ferocious competitor everything of value that you have. You're giving them your relationships with your customers. You're giving them your knowledge of the particular products that you sell. And because they own all that infrastructure, not only for e-commerce, but also we can talk about Amazon Web Services and increasingly Alexa, their sort of voice operating system. All of those pieces of infrastructure give them this godlike view of everything that is happening across the economy. And from that vantage point, they can pick off hot selling products that some business has found and start selling them themselves and demote that business in the search result. Or they can simply use their gatekeeper power to raise fees. And so, what we found is that the businesses that are selling on Amazon's site are increasingly having to pay a bigger and bigger cut of their sales. Today, about 1 out of every $3 in sales that a business makes on Amazon's site, they have to pay to Amazon. That's up from 19% just a few years ago. So this is a company that governs our markets, that effectively levies a tax on our trade. And if you have a problem with it, the judge and jury, again, is Amazon. So again, it's back to this issue of control and power.
Yeah.
Which again is an area that Walmart blazed a trail.
What did you say, Tom?
Walmart blazed that trail in many regards.
Right.
Oh, absolutely. And, Walmart came along just as we were putting some of our most important laws to control retailer power, the laws that we use to keep AMP, the Atlantic and Pacific, the big grocer of its day, we kept them in check. And in fact, kept them so much on their heels that they were forced to accept collective bargaining, pay farmers a fair rate, and independent grocers could still operate, right? We used our anti-monopoly to push back against AMP, and that created a much more fair and just grocery sector. We put those same laws on the shelf right about the time that Walmart was starting to leave Arkansas and branch out across the country. And they were able to go into towns and sell at a complete loss, like lose tons of money. And then when all the local competitors closed, they would raise their prices. They would strong arm suppliers to get a better deal and actually force those suppliers to raise what they were charging to competing retailers, giving Walmart this built-in advantage, this way to hurt its competitors through its suppliers and this kind of bully behavior. Bezos picked up that playbook and extended it, spectacularly. And again, because of law. I think that's totally right, Tom.
Yeah, I read a book that you may know about, Goliath, by Matt Stoller of the Economic Liberties Institute. And one of the most striking things was in the late 20s and 30s, Tom, kind of to harken back to what you were saying about education, the public consciousness was so radically different at that time. I mean, people really understood the kind of domination of big business and the incredible harm that it was doing. And it was a huge movement that partly, FDR, I think, with the New Deal was basically trying to save capitalism from the capitalists, in effect. It was so out of control, and it pales in the face of what we have today. But, we also forget, in a way, that we live here in the Wild West of America, and the EU is quite a bit more stringent, and they have actually had enough political will to make some steps, and there are actions arising in Australia now, I know. Outside this country, there is actually more going on than there is here. Tom, I saw you wanted to say something.
Well, I was just going to say a lot of that lack of public knowledge is a function of monopolies in media. MSNBC, the liberal network, when Ajit Pai was destroying net neutrality. So right now, Comcast can read every email I send. They can look at every website I participate in. They know everything that happens, and this is true of all of us. Our internet service providers now can spy on us in ways that are just mind-boggling. And Ajit Pai and the Trump administration made all that possible by blowing up the whole Title II part of the Telecommunications Act. There was not a peep out of anybody on MSNBC about that. As I recall, Rachel Maddow did one show about it. And probably somewhat reluctantly. and MSNBC is owned by Comcast, which is the largest internet service provider in the United States, and spent a fortune lobbying to make that happen. So, we have a handful of corporations now that control the public dialogue, and then sitting atop that, or perhaps under that, like the roots of a tree, kind of the substrate or subsurface of that, you've got Facebook, which has, I'm personally of the opinion that Mark Zuckerberg is the most powerful man in the world, and and is able to influence public opinion similarly, and I never saw any really aggressive conversations about net neutrality there either, although those would tend to be more scattered. But it's we need to take this on systemically, top to bottom.
Well, Tom, in that light, you talked before about education and getting more into the public consciousness. How do you see that moving forward? What do we do now?
It's obviously we've had a setback over the last 4 years, but I think what we need to be doing now is leaning on, in particular, our Democratic legislators. The Republican Party seems to be kind of a lost cause now. Basically, since 1980, it's become officially the party of grifters and billionaires and giant corporations. Tragically, but not to make this partisan. I mean, this is not a statement of partisan preferences. I would argue it's a statement of fact. And a good chunk of the Democratic Party is right in there with them. And that's part of the work that we've got to do.
Yeah. We have just a few minutes left. I wonder, Stacey and Maurice, if you have any parting thoughts or what you would like people to most know.
So I'll just say to part like that what Tom is just getting into is really actually a juicy subset of monopoly power, which is, it's not just an economic power, it is also a political power. And that power doesn't just come from the amount that they give on the books to legislators. There's a real fear of going after Zuckerberg, going after Bezos, being seen as going after one of these companies. Folks are really scared to take them on. And we end up with these things like we'll allow Facebook to impanel their own review of their practices that they get to pick the people on and then decide whether they want to implement the changes that they, these wacky things are like, well, it'd be easier to just have government do that. But we're so, we're so afraid of these sort of too big to regulate companies that we don't do anything. So just to say that that's a nice pin there on political power.
And they punish Maurice.
That's right, yeah.
When I started talking about Facebook on my radio show, they closed down my personal Facebook account, which is only my family, right? I'm not posted to it, very much in years. It goes back to the very beginning. I keep track of all my relatives back in Michigan. And they literally shut it down for 2 months until I wrote an op-ed about it that was published in Salon, and suddenly it reappeared.
Right. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, and I think the sort of the flip side of that, if I can put it that way, of this is that the opportunity here by taking on monopoly power directly, going after this sort of private accumulation of power, is that it's a real opportunity to reinvigorate the idea of democratic government. And I mentioned that the House Antitrust Subcommittee's work and the investigation that they did this year. One of the really electrifying moments in that was they had a hearing in late July where they had the 4 CEOs, Jeff Bezos and the others up there. And what I thought was so amazing about that hearing was that they did not, many of the hearings that we see, there's a kind of deference that lawmakers give to these CEOs, a sense of like, I don't really understand technology, but you do, and you're powerful, and all that sort of like, and letting them to grandstand. And this committee did not have any of that. They made it very clear that these companies are subject to the law and subject to accountability in terms of how they just conducted themselves. If one of the CEOs was not answering the question and was starting to like wander off and do a PR thing, they just cut them off and moved on. politely, but just really clear cut. And they brought in all of these voices of ordinary people, small business owners, workers, other people who'd been harmed, and gave them, people who they'd uncovered as part of the investigation, really gave them voice during the hearing. And so I think part of the reason I'm excited about this growing anti-monopoly movement is that it's a chance not only to counter corporate power, but inherently within it, a chance to think about how we can get government back that actually works for us.
Yeah, I mean, we're fundamentally facing a crisis of democracy here, if we've ever actually had one in this country, which in fact, in my opinion, we have not. I would imagine you all have a similar view in that regard. But I think we're coming full circle as a country in that way, and a very big long-term cycle. I mean, we've kind of reached the end game of as far as this system can go, and one way or the other, it's going to crash and burn. One of the things, I mean, it's almost like a Stockholm syndrome that people are awakening from now, of identifying with their captors. But the thing that puzzles me and that I can't really wrap my mind around, Hannah Arendt called it the banality of evil. The incredible harm that is being done, obviously, to literally poach the planet, I mean, on a physical plane, and then the enormous suffering. And what do you need all this money for? I mean, it's like Scrooge McDuck. It's just beyond insane. I don't know if any of you have a thought about that.
Yeah, I mean, I've tried to explain something like Bezos's wealth to children before, and the saying is, if you stacked $1 bills just of his wealth, you'd be way past the space station by the time you were finished counting. Of course, he could never use that, and making it more insulting. And speaking to the problem that we have, they get a huge PR boost when they give these tiny percentages of their wealth to solve problems that they are actually contributing to. So Bezos, just recently made a lot of headlines by contributing to a climate fund. Amazon is one of the worst polluters, of course, in America, probably the world. So it's just, I think we have a lot of work to do to sort of unravel all of that.
And I think we need to deal with the sociopathy of great wealth. A number of these people are just literally screaming sociopath.
Well, it's interesting. I know, Tom, you have a background in psychology, but Robert Hare, who created the Psychopathy Index, which he developed that work originally mostly with incarcerated people for very violent crimes. And he said if he wasn't working in prisons, he'd be doing this on Wall Street, basically. And in fact, if you check every box on the Psychopathy Index, that would become the criteria for hiring your CEO. So I think that's kind of where we are these days. And it is a psychopathic system and at the moment we have finally 45 is on the way out, but he's been kind of a babbling hood ornament on the Hummer of a plutocracy gone off-road, So on that note, I am so grateful to all of you for the incredible work you do, and I learned so much just being here with you now, and I'm sure our Bioneers community is very grateful as well. And I wish you all great good fortune with everything you're doing, and we'd love to stay in touch, and anytime you have updates and stuff we can share with our community, we'd really love to do that.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
An honor and a pleasure. Thank you.